Awesome. Welcome everyone to Metagov Seminar. These are weekly research seminars hosted by the Metagov community, a laboratory for digital governance. And my name is Val Elefante. I take she or they pronouns, and I'm a community lead at Metagov. It's my total honor and pleasure today to be hosting this seminar and facilitating us in a discussion about a book that recently came out that I really, really love called Relationality. We have the author here, David J. We're going to be, yeah, here's the book. We're going to be discussing this book, some of the themes in the book, concepts that David has put forth and kind of relate those concepts to a lot of things that we talk about and think about a lot in the Metagov community space. So welcome, folks. Thank you for joining. And yeah, let's dive into it. How the format will basically be about a 20-minute book talk format. So I've prepared some questions for David, and so we'll do that, and then we'll open it up to questions from y'all. So as you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat or just type the word stack in the chat, and then you'll be added to the list, and we'll go in order based on who has, raised their hand basically first. So feel free to get your notes note-taking tool out so that you can post your questions and we can have an awesome discussion. Cool. So we did intros, announcements, and now it's time to begin. So yeah, like I said, it's my honor to bring David J here into the space, or DJ. David is a LGBTQIA plus organizer and activist, has been for many years, particularly when it comes to the asexual community and bringing the IA plus part of or the A plus part of into the LGBTQ spectrum. We first connected back when I was working on a project with the Solutions Journalism Network. And I bring that up because at that time, solutions journalism was this kind of paradigm shifting concept for me that I think in a lot of ways, relationality is a very similar concept. It's a lens through which, ever since I read your book, David, I feel like it's changed the way that I look at almost everything in my life. So if you don't know about solution journalism, they're great. Relationality is kind of another lens here that David brings forth in this book that is really powerful. So I'm really excited to bring it here to the space with you all. Um, I reached out to David and he invited me he was visiting Brooklyn and invited me on a walk. And so I think that speaks to the way that he just off the jump was like super eager to be in relationship with someone who had expressed interest or opened up this inquiry into his work. And we went on a walk around Herbert von King Park in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, which was really special. And I will truly never forget that. Um, so yeah, basically I have prepared I'll let David introduce himself and then I'll kind of give a short summary, 5-minute summary of the book and some of the key concepts that stuck out to me. And then I have about 4 or so questions. But David, would love to hear you just briefly introduce yourself and your work.
Thank you so much, Val. Always really great to be in touch with you. I've been following the work of the Metagov Seminar for quite some time after talking with Nation Schneider. Huge fan of the really necessary work that you all do. And there's so much I want to learn from you all. I think questions of governance are a place where that feels so important that I want to explore in my work. So really, really honored to be here. Really excited for our discussion today. And I guess I'll introduce myself. The book, though, the book sort of comes out of my journey from loneliness to relational power. I started as Val mentioned, I identify as asexual. I started as this ace kid who really was told that I'd be alone for my whole life. Was told that relationship was not a thing I could access because I wasn't building relationships that were romantic or sexual. And so I've been on a journey to redefine for myself what relationship is so that it's a thing that I can form. And along that journey, I not only learned to form personal relationships, like I now have this beautiful three-parent family. I do a lot of work around communities of care, but I discovered organizing. I helped to build a community that became the central gathering point for ACE people. Um, and I got to see how bringing people into relationship, especially people who felt isolation or had a part of themselves that felt isolated, bringing people into relationship was this immensely powerful way not only to heal us, but to build collective care and ultimately collective power. And that arc between connection, care, and power is one that's really driven me in my life and has seemed incredibly transformational. It opens up new possibilities for creativity, it opens up new possibilities for healing, and it opens up, I think, really necessary new opportunities for governance. So, my work and the work of my book really focuses on the question of if connecting people is so powerful, why is it so hard to get paid to do it? Why is it so hard to fundraise for this work? Why are our institutions sort of almost like I talk about relational invisibility? Why are they often unable to see something that, for me, for so many people I know, is so necessary and so powerful? But one of the questions that I get to in my book that I'm really excited to dive into in more detail here is questions about what becomes possible in governance when we create spaces where people connect and build trust. How that opens up pathways and demands us to go down pathways away from authoritarianism and centralized power towards something else. And I talk some about how that exists in the movements that I build, but this question of like how we govern when we are prioritizing building relationship is one that's very open and raw for me that I'm excited to be open and raw with y'all about today.
Awesome. Yeah, so I would love to start with just a brief summary, especially some of the concepts. Like I said, these are to me have been like really paradigm shifting concepts that you introduce and ways that you redefine relationship in the book. So a few of those for me, I mean, you have a whole chapter on kind of what are relationships, and you propose that they inspired by Octavia Butler, who's an author I'm actively reading right now, which is cool to kind of read in conjunction with your book. But relationships are basically when people change each other, right? So I think that that is a really powerful framework for thinking about relationships. Another definition that you propose is about people kind of invested in figuring out how to spend meaningful time together. I love both of those. I think they work really well, and I loved. I think it was in your book talk where you said you tried to kind of look up like on Wikipedia what a relationship is, and it was like, do you mean this type of relationship or this type or that? And you were like, no, I just mean relationships. And so I love the way that you propose those definitions to give us kind of a broader understanding of what even a relationship of any kind is. Something else, another concept that is really awesome and paradigm shifting to me is like relational agency, which is one's capacity to find relationships that improve their life. I think we'll get into this when we talk about um, overlap between like relational agency and I think there's a lot there when it comes to community self-governance. But we'll get there. I think it's important to contrast some of these concepts with like the antidote to them, or let's say like a relationship, relational agency. When you don't have that, you're in relationship perhaps of domination, and it's when someone is trying to change someone else, but without being changed themselves. So you're using that same kind of framework to understand domination through the lens of relationships, which I find really, really powerful. Um, one big lesson in the book or kind of argument you make is that we can predict the conditions that lead to relationships. So we can create containers where relationships can happen and we can predict that they will happen, but not where those relationships will lead. I think that's a really powerful concept and one I want to explore more. Um, I think, yeah, I love the way that you contrast again, kind of what you're striving for with existing paradigms. So you bring up ownership and you talk about how ownership is something that actually, through the lens of relationship, it's a way for preventing someone from being in relationship with something. I think for a lot of us in governance space, we think about ownership and it's yeah, really helpful to kind of bring those concepts in together with each other where yeah, ownership is basically like a blockage of a potential relationship. Um, cool. So those are kind of some definitions or core concepts that I think shape a lot of our work and will be useful in our discussion. Um, you also talk about lineages, like how we form relationships are based on our personal lineages and our community lineages. So, when we want to make them happen, like we have to kind of look back or go inwards and understand, like we're going to learn a lot from about how to make relationships based on our lives and the things we've experienced in our lives and the people in our lives. Um, and then finally, you get into like kind of the societal failure to invest in relationships, how we can invest in relationships, and then you end the book with this beautiful speculative fiction about what happens if we do invest in relationships and how we might kind of restructure society around relationships. So my first question, I want to just draw the link between your work and Metagov more explicitly. So, um, like I mentioned, Metagov is a laboratory for digital governance. We cultivate tools, practices, and communities that enable self-governance in the digital age. That's our mission. And I was reading and thinking a lot about relationality and self-governance. And, I kept kind of arguing. I think you gave me a new way to argue that self-governing communities uh, give humans a greater ability to form deep, meaningful relationships. It gives people, self-governance give people more creativity about the types of relationships that they form with each other. They increase relational agency, I'd argue, rather than, conforming to rigid hierarchies of relationships of dominance and subordination, such as bosses and employees in a workplace or admins and users in software, kind of that implicit feudalism that Metagov is kind of trying to disrupt. So I would be curious, David, to hear from you for a first question is just how do you relate these two concepts of relationality or relational agency and community self-governance? How do you see the linkage there?
Um, I want to thank you so much. I want to quickly contrast uh, corporations and movements as I understand them, and talk about the spectrum between authoritarianism and like something else that I think you all are imagining, and loneliness and connection. So, loneliness, one of the things I learned in my research is that the opposite of loneliness is not. Loneliness is different from social isolation. Loneliness does not mean that you don't have relationships. Loneliness means that you don't have agency over your relationships. You may be connected to a lot of people at work. You may have a family. You may have lots of people filling up your life. But if all those relationships consist of obligation, if they're all things you are forced to do, you don't have any agency over them, you can still feel lonely. And so, this question of agency, this question of can I evolve the relationships in my life? Can I find new relationships? Can I release relationships? Can I communicate and navigate conflict in ways that lets relationships shift to meet my needs? That question of agency is really, really central to me. And has been central, to my own journey, also to my thinking. And so when we have a lot of lonely people, defining people as in relationships without agency. There is a strong link between loneliness and authoritarianism. This is talked about. Hannah Arendt, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, talks about the link, says that totalitarianism is institutionalized loneliness. Um, and and as when people are lonely and have no agency, um, it makes sense to uh, entrust a centralized authority to like centralize resources, to centralize power, to entrust someone to kind of protect you and look out for you because all of the other people around you are just threats. But the more you have agency, the more someone has agency to build and evolve their relationships, the less centralizing power makes sense. The more you and the people you're holding agency with kind of want a piece of that power, and the more you crave the messiness of figuring out how to share power with people. And so uh, I think there is a way that when we create spaces where people connect, where they learn to build trust, where they learn to change one another, it moves us on this spectrum away from authoritarianism, which I think of as both what is unfolding in the United States, where I'm based right now, and the default norm in most corporations, to something that is much more distributed, decentralized, and democratic. Um, And the example of this that I've explored most of my work, because I come from a movement organizing background. That's sort of the lineage I draw from. And uh, I look at some of the movements I've seen where you have a group of people at the center of the movement um, who kind of are just respected by everyone. And they're all telling slightly different stories about what the movement should do. It's not that they have a bank account. They don't necessarily have a lot of formal governance authority, but they are competing to see who can tell the story that best mobilizes everyone else. And whoever tells the story tells a story that mobilizes the most that resonates in the most people's bodies, that mobilizes them to take action the most, whatever story wins in that sort of like collaborative and competitive churn in the middle of a movement is what winds up directing where the movement goes. So there's a form of governance that is about storytelling. It's about storytelling that resonates with our values. It's about knowing how to instill a sense of hope in people, and whoever kind of whatever narratives emerge that create the most hope wind up functionally governing the direction of the movement. That feels to me very, very different than, or like that sort of at least one imagining I have of what's on the end of the spectrum that's not authoritarianism.
Awesome. Yeah, that I love that. The Hannah Arendt quote is really powerful there too. Um, yeah, that leads me right into my next question, which uh, is kind of coming back to that point of the opposite of, or not opposite, but like, we can't predict where relationships will go, right? I think we can predict where they can happen, we can create containers for them, but we can't actually predict where they'll go. Though you do a bunch of physics and you talk about how what we do know about them is that they will help us change, they will help us evolve, they will make us resilient, and they will transform us. Um, which kind of is like, it is a direction. We do know something there. Um, I guess, yeah, so my question is kind of getting into this again, coming back to self-governance. I think a lot of challenges that our community in Metagov and also in the kind of uh, complex governance space, we often get told like, oh, well, you're choosing between participation and efficiency, right? Like, y'all, you governance people, you never actually get anything done. It's like time and time again, it is a challenge of the more you kind of open up that space, sometimes, it takes longer or whatever. So one quote in your book is uh, on page 142, you say that movement scholar Darcy Leach argues that the real problem is not how to avoid the tyranny of the structurelessness, but how to sustain structures of tyrannylessness. And I just loved that quote so much because we talk so much about tyranny of the structurelessness in this community. And it kind of gets to what you were just saying around like values alignment and kind of how to get stuff done with people. So yeah, can you speak to how relationships can and perhaps relationships and governance, good governance together, how we can prove people wrong and actually use the two together and get stuff done?
Uh, so I think as someone who hangs out in movements, like that's proven all the time, right? Movements take on giant corporations and win all the time. So there's a quick story I want to tell about BoJack Horseman. Anyone here watch BoJack Horseman? In season I think 4 or 5 of BoJack Horseman, they had an out asexual character, and their writers' room reached out. Decided they were going to have this out asexual character. They reach out to a queer media organization called GLAAD. GLAAD reached out to me because I'm this asexual organizer. I reached out to the head of Aces Los Angeles, Asexual Los Angeles, that happened to be run by an ace comedy writer. And 72 hours after the like Netflix said, "Hey, we think we want to have an asexual character," we had asexual comedy writers in their writers' room advising them on what is a pretty big media win for us, right? So if you think about that, like We are a grassroots network that runs on $3,000 a year, which is what it takes to keep our servers online. We were able to get an asexual comedy writer into their writer's room in 72 hours when a really impactful opportunity came up. Like most large corporations could not do that on that timeline. There is a way that we're adaptable. There's a way that we are ready to take advantage of opportunities in a way that most large hierarchical organizations could not dream of, even if they have exponentially more resources. This is also, there's a similar campaign in which we took on large pharma industries, a pharma industry, and the pharma industry in one. Um, and so I think we win all the time, but we win through this radically different set of tactics that really leverage our relationships. We have access to so many more resources when we can be in relationship together than when we need resources to compel people to do what we want. And uh, so I think there is something you talked about shared values, you talked about the tyranny of structurelessness. Um, what I've found is that when relationships evolve, if a relationship is sort of a shared understanding we have of how to spend time together. It really helps if we have some North Star that's guiding us, something that is telling us the way of the kinds of ways of spending time together that might feel aligned. So if I'm in a community with people who share values, if I show up in a community and I tell a story about what motivates me, and then you tell a story about what motivates you, and those stories sort of make our bodies light up in a similar way, and the stories of everyone in the room make our bodies light up in a similar way, um, we have a directional sense of how to spend time together in ways that are going to bring everyone along. Um, and that is not a strategy. It is not a like top-down defined thing, but it is this kind of embodied sense of direction that we share that I think can get us to places like the story, I told about BoJack Horseman. So I think there is when we know how to when we can get good at building trust around shared value, shared sense of purpose, I think that there are immensely powerful things that happen that most of our modern institutions kind of can't conceive of.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Derek, I'm watching you also like respond and my body's feeling the same way. I felt that way a lot reading this book. I think, yeah, I guess I want to as I was just preparing that question and stuff, like I was just thinking about how maybe it's not that, we don't like opening up governance does, it's not that we don't get stuff done. It's that maybe the outcomes are more unpredictable. But when we are with people who we're values aligned with, we're on relational time, right? And you say that relational time moves incredibly slowly, frustratingly backwards, and then all at once. And I just have felt that so much in my life I feel like I've been on relational time in my work, in my life, and like following that flow. It's like, I don't feel like it's not happening. I feel like it's just on a different time scale. It's not like this end goal predictability, KPI, KPI, KPI done. It's like something weird of like, yeah, that kind of slowly then backwards then all at once thing is so real. Um, and I love when you talk about values aligned, finding people who are values aligned. Actually, it's not about like, oh, let's align on our values. It's respect and kindness and this. Like, I love the way you give us a really tangible way of doing values alignment, which is actually sharing your struggle. And that's something that I'm excited to bring into different communities where I'm like Metagov or others where I'm a person who can facilitate and host space. Um, Actually, yeah, it's less about kind of like let's define our values and more about like let's share our challenges and like why are we here? How did we get here in the first place? So that's just a really, really powerful tool, I think. Um, okay, next question. Okay, well, so I want to briefly mention you mentioned kind of well, okay, you quote W.B. Du Bois, democracy has failed because so many fear it, and the essence of the democratic process is free discussion. when you say free discussion, a lot of people in this space in Metagov are kind of have tapped into that power of free discussion, and a lot of us think about creating spaces for deliberation in an online environment where we might be censored or where there's like social censorship, like cancel culture and PC culture. I feel like the idea that people really fear free discussion resonates a lot right now in this current political moment, and I think there's like two places or probably more, but at least two where real discussion can happen. And that's either one in real relationship where trust is built, or two, behind a screen, like where people can be totally anonymous. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the role of deliberation or free discussion in um, or just right now and how we might move more from a world where like online, at least where a lot of two is happening, everyone's behind a screen, but free discussion, more into a world where one can happen, where people are actually in relationships of trust.
Uh, so one of the things that came out of my research was this that was really transformative. My idea was this idea of evolutionary rate, right? I was looking for a way to describe uh, scientifically these spaces where relationships really happen, where they really thrive. And I came across this idea in ecology, where ecologists started looking at different environments um, and said, hey, if we compare a coral reef to the open ocean, if we compare a rainforest canopy to other parts of the rainforest, if we compare a tidal pool to a beach, some ecosystems just seem to be better at producing new and interesting things. They have more biomass, they have more biodiversity, vastly than others. And all of those ecosystems seem to have something in common. And when I looked at the things that those ecosystems had in common, they had a lot to do with like they paralleled a lot of the tactics I thought of as an organizer, right? Um, ecosystem that bridge like the edge zone between the forest and the grassland has a higher evolutionary rate than either the forest or the grassland. Places with fractal dimensionality, with lots of tiny niches. Think about a coral reef, right? Lots of tiny niches where things can sort of do their own thing and then pop out and interact with one another, have a much higher evolutionary rate than the open ocean. So when you talk about deliberation, I think a lot about what are the containers that deliberation is happening in. If you look at blue sky, it's more like an open ocean. It's a little bit factualized, but everyone is talking to everyone else. Um, and the most relational spaces tend to be ones that are like this, or sometimes even smaller than this. Like if we were to all go into breakout rooms with one another, where there are you have a small group of people who really are paying attention to one another, who have come from different, often radically different places, but have something that connects them, some part of themselves that's getting seen in that room that normally doesn't get seen, that they're approaching from different angles. That is a really, really powerful way to connect and build trust. And it is not what the internet is built to do right now, because it's not, that does not align with the business models, right? Like an engagement optimized feed where you were competing for attention with everyone else, but you were guaranteed attention from no one. That is a deeply, deeply a-relational way to be. So when I think about dialogue, I often think about how we build a broadcast to convening gradient. How do you go from I have an audience and I'm broadcasting that to that audience, and the only thing I care about is whether the audience like clicks on the stuff I want them to click on, which is very transactional, to I if I am talking to a bunch of people, I'm also inviting them into conversation with one another in thoughtful, small ways, ideally that bridge intersect. What are those ways that we invite people into with one another?
Oh no, David, you froze. I assume he froze for everyone, right? Yeah, okay. Oh no. Hmm. I'm gonna message him on Signal. Well, so while we wait for David to unfreeze, I'm like, just unfreeze, David. Um, I want to give you all, I mean, you should really go read the book. It's so, so good. But to entice you even more, David, um, chapter 6 is epic, and David talks about again, just using this relationship or relational lens, um, kind of critiques like a lot of the backwards colonialist capitalistic systems through the lens of relationships. And so he talks about particularly ownership and during like colonization and how the British East India Company basically the workers like landed on the shores of the now US and like basically were forced to abandon any kind of relationship oriented way of being or thinking because their investors were sort of forcing them to like put profit, above all costs. And so kind of this like separation and when the company took on these investors, it forced the workers who were then like on the ground out here, but to like abandon, just drop any kind of relational way of being in when they arrived here. So yeah, the kind of like effect of the separation of ownership from the people working and management. Um, and seeing that through the lens of relationships. And then also my probably favorite quote or section of the book is when he talks about Adam Smith. Oh yeah, you're back. Cool. And he talks about Adam Smith on page 169. And I never knew this, but apparently Adam Smith was writing all of his books and stuff of capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And at the whole entire time, meanwhile, he's living at his mother's home and she's feeding him and taking care of him. And he was not, making money working at that time. And so I just think it's like, yeah, it's such a clear relational invisibility that you point out. And the quote that I wanted to just read for us to sit on and think about, and then we'll move to Q&A. But so on page 169, you say, this relational invisibility created a false justification for European superiority, since it obscured the wisdom of civilizations operating on relational principles and left a dangerously false image of people living in chaos who needed order imposed on them. It also created a fear of and fascination with relational power, a fear and fascination that was projected onto the bodies of women, people of color, and women of color especially. Um, just like, whoa, I don't know. That part really stuck out to me. It got me on a whole thread of like, what is relational power? How is it distinct from other types of power? Maybe like I call it like role status money power. Uh, like why is it so feared? Then it was just like to me the question I have, and maybe we can answer it, or maybe we want to go to Q&A, but like relational power just feels like really the only real power. It's power that like can't just be taken away. Someone's like status or role can just be like, you're fired. But relational power is really, to me, like I was like, oh, maybe it's like actually the only power that is power. And then you kind of point us towards a world where we might organize societies around that type of relational power in the last chapter, which I really love. So yeah, we can engage if you have any comments or thoughts on that, feel free. But I say, yeah, we should move to Q&A as soon as we can.
I would love to talk about relational power, but let's move to Q&A.
Cool. Well, I have not been looking at the chat and keeping account of who's on the stack, so sorry about that. Mm-mm-mm. Let's see. Lydia has a question. There's a well-known number that describes the maximum number of actual social ties. It is approximate, but it works well in organizational research. Are there similar estimates for relationships? Interesting.
So this is Dunbar's number. I talk about Dunbar's research because it really proves that the reason we evolved a large neocortex was to make predictions about relationships. Um, that our brains exist to let us navigate relationships. They're very expensive, they're very awkward, but it's the best way we have to do the really incredible and hard work of navigating the relational world around us, of having relational power. Um, and Dunbar's number is 150 people. That is, if you're in a group of 150 people, you can track everyone's relationship with everyone. So it works a little bit different in modern society because we're not just tracking, like we're tracking that number of relationships, but it's not one contained group of 150 people. It's spread out across many groups. But I really like it because it acknowledges that we have a limited capacity to be in relationship. If relationship is about changing and being changed, at some point we can't add more of it to our life without becoming overwhelmed. And so if we want to expand, if we want to invite more relationship into the world, if to use a word I don't like, if we want to scale, then there's two ways to do it, right? Either we demand that all the relationship people we're in relationship with are homogenous and the same. Like we use power to try to force similarity on them and erase their difference, or we trust people to build relationship who are aligned with our values that aren't us, so that the power isn't all coming, the control isn't all coming back to us, but we're trusting other people. And so that expanding our relational capacity by trusting, building and trusting communities around us is one theme of governance, as opposed to through dominance and homogeneity. That's one big theme. Anyway, that was far from Dunbar, but um, Val
Cool.
or Rick, I don't know. I don't know what the process is.
Um, well, Rick's hand, I think, I mean, I feel like it's been up for a little while, but we had some questions pop up in the chat, like in the middle of the session, such as Faison had a question of can it be top down, bottom up, and diagonal all at the same time? To which you responded, it can, though the top down needs to be ready for all those things. Can you say more on that?
Um, just that, yeah, I think this comes, a lot of my work's focused on relational resourcing. Like I'm talking to foundations, I'm talking to people that deploy money to be like, hey, can you learn how to fund this work without needing to control it? And I think there is a role for people in existing institutions who have centralized power to say, oh, we are going to recognize the benefit of people bringing into relationship. We're going to recognize the benefit of them governing one another and like maybe building power adjacent to us that isn't always going to agree to us with us because we see that a world that has more relationship and more power around a set of existing around shared values is preferable to a world where we have all the power. So I think that there are ways for people in power to realize that they can share it but a lot of times especially in I think current corporate culture, there's a sense of anything that reduces our power and builds someone else's is a threat. Um, and it's that capacity to trust in people building power on people doing things you don't control around values that you share, that I think is really key to and diagonal all working together.
Awesome. Um, Aishwarya asked, where'd it go? A really awesome question about timeline. How do you reconcile the time it takes to achieve our movement's goals with the urgency of the problems we want to solve?
So um, it is complicated. Like that is a really great and hard question, and I think that there might be times where we need to sacrifice relationality for urgency, and it's worth asking the question like um, can we build relationship in the process of what we're doing? Can we build collective care and collective power in the process of what we're doing? Because ultimately, like the BoJack Horseman story, relationship is going to move a lot faster than hierarchy. Um, and so if we're responding to something quickly, are we saying we don't have time to think about relationship at all? We don't have time to think about people building trust. We don't have time to think about people's longevity. We just need to like get to next week and not think about anything beyond it? Or is there enough capacity to think about how bringing people together on urgency is also building relationship trust and capacity on a longer time scale? I think if we are caught in a system of perpetual urgency. That is one of the tools of colonialism. That is one of the tools of white supremacy. And like, yes, white supremacy and colonialism are creating those conditions as well. To use language from my political lineage, that may or may not resonate with everyone here, but um, but I think if we are caught in a place of so much urgency that thinking about relationship doesn't feel possible, then um, it feels like there's a real lost opportunity.
Mm. Yeah, I love the way you're modeling also using language from your lineage, and that's really powerful. Um, okay, Rick, I saw your hand. One more question from the chat, and then I'm gonna pass it to you. But Natalia's question is on this vein too of um, she says, I find that heavy relationality. Well, Natalia, if you would like to unmute and read your question, feel free, or else I'll just read it.
Oh, sure. So there's an implied question in there. Um, I find that heavy relationality can lead to really big feelings of a Shakespearean nature, such as betrayal and murder. I find that there are people in healthy ecosystems who know how to handle these big feelings. Um, but basically they kind of get screwed over. Often the current economy tries to wash away those big feelings and does not support the people who help with their maintenance or ecological metabolism, because those feelings shouldn't really be existing or be generated by the system. I'm wondering if you have uh, general thoughts about that problem in general.
Yeah, one of the things, oh, I hope I didn't freeze again. One of the things that uh, I wound up in a lot of conversations with peace building organizations, like people who go in conflict zones. Um, and a lot of the history of nonviolent movement that uh, one of the things that kind of becomes really central to governance as we get into these more relational spaces is conflict mediation. It is creating, like, if people have strong feelings, which are going to be inevitable if you're doing relational work, how do you create containers for those strong feelings so that they don't boil over in ways that harm the community, but ultimately lead to a place where people trust one another more? Um, and this is, I think, a capacity that some movements, a way that some movements have gotten really, really powerful is just recognizing those feelings come up, creating containers around them, and then learning from seeing them as a source of wisdom to show where the communities needs to head. Not just a thing to be contained, but a thing to learn from. Um, and so that question of how communities create spaces for generative conflict, kind of conflict, creating the conditions for generative conflict central to governance, is one that's come up a lot for me. And that's a little bit more of a high level answer. There's some examples of this I'd love to give, but I want to be respectful of other folks' questions.
Awesome. Rick?
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank the organization for bringing this book to my attention. I didn't know anything about it beforehand, but thank you very much. The second is what I really appreciate about the way you're speaking, David, is that you're an amazing raconteur of your work, which, as you well know, storytelling and being able to, is incredibly important. But you know, I want to focus on the issue of all relational power is not created equal. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So if one were to focus on the notion of virtuous relational empowerment and power as a vehicle for facilitating not only self-governance, but shared governance, collective governance, and meta-governance, I was wondering to what extent in your book you may have tapped into that notion of storytelling that deals with the issue of using virtuous relational power for affecting governance at multiple levels.
So two themes I want to respond to, and I don't think I'm able to fully get to the depth and complexity of your question, which I really, really love. The first is that I'm all about relationality, I do not believe that all relationality is good. My day job is working with trust and safety employees at major tech companies. So like they're looking a lot at hate groups. They're looking a lot at places where people are invited into a relationship in ways that are toxic, both for them and for other people. So um, if people are invited into a relationship, the question of what values are guiding that relationship is really, really central. And I think for me, it's important to say not like all relationship is good, but where is a relationship happening that resonates with the values that I hold? And how am I going to show up there? And sometimes I will work to actively undermine the conditions of a relationship that strongly is discordant with my values. And then the second piece you said is around story. I think story, and I'm early in my understanding of this, is a incredibly rich way to convey relational information. If I want to share something about the values that drive me, if I like, to your point earlier, Val, like say the word respect and define it and analytically talk about respect for 20 minutes, it's not going to tell you as much as if I tell a story about why and how respect is shown up in my life as a thing that matters. So there is a way that the art of storytelling is the art of conveying complex relational information that's really needed and therefore critical to relational governance.
If I can just quickly respond, I was at a recent research conference. For the first time in my professional career, somebody introduced themselves as a relational scientist to me, which was, wow, that's amazing. Never heard of the term before. Probably old hat for other people, but it was new for me. But in terms of actually advancing, the upside of it, as you were alluding to, there's a negative. You want to mitigate against the negative, but you also want to harness the powerful side of it. Any further thoughts, and then I'll hand over to the next person.
I think I appreciate that. I think for the sake of time, I wanna keep going because I know we're almost out of time.
Cool. Faison asked a question on what does it mean to actually flourish as human beings in a world where tech is reshaping our narratives, realities, and truth with all our actions and inactions? What are the significant barriers that are bound to stay in the investment of relational work, not just monetary investment? Faison, I know you mentioned you have toddler screen, but if you'd like to add anything there, cool.
So I'm thinking about this question. The significant barriers that are
Maybe barriers to
I'm curious what you mean
investing.
by bound to stay. I can say um, uh, I can talk a little about the barriers to relational work that I've seen. Val alluded to this, but um, when we build relationship, one of the things that seems to be a fundamental like mathematical law is that when we create the conditions for relationship, the more effective we are, the less predictable the outcome is. If I can sometimes know the outcome of a bad conversation ahead of time, the better the conversation is, the less I know about exactly where it's going to land. That seems to be true of all relational systems. And that really messes with the way that we think about investment. If you're filling out a grant application, if you're talking to investors, you need to say, this is what's going to happen. This is my plan to control all the factors to make it happen. And then these are my measures to say that the thing that I predicted is going to happen. If you're building a community, all of that need to predict gets in the way. It kills the community rather than helping it thrive because communities fundamentally do not work like factories. And so I think the barrier to relational investment, a culture of that I think is holding most of our resources right now that demands control and predictability in order to this. And a lot of the work that I'm doing, which now that I won't get into, is trying that control. I also think, I really hope I haven't lost you all again. Uh, I also believe that, um, crap.
No, you're here, David, but you did freeze for a second there.
Oh, I'm here. Okay, sorry. Um, uh, that um, I'll just say that this play out a lot in our tech world, where there is technology that up all the time that just can't get the investment or support it needs to succeed. So it looks like, yeah, you all video are frozen, but hopefully the audio is coming through.
Yeah, it did. Mel, you might be our last question, and unfortunately, if you are our last question, there were definitely a few in there that didn't get addressed, so we'll take it into the Slack or we should do a follow-up community call to go into a deeper discussion. But Mel, take it away. Let's squeeze one more in.
Thank you. This has been an awesome discussion. And I guess my question is based on what you've said, which I have a hard time disagreeing with any of it. And I try and work in the what I'll call like trust tech space. Do you think that I think repeated disagreement and getting through it together is one of the hallmarks of relationship building. And so there was this interesting quote. I was watching The Matrix, and it's like, you have to fight somebody to truly know them. And as a concept, I was like, wow, the people I have fought, I do feel like I know better. And so I would love if you could speak to that in relation to maybe your thinking around kind of generating this book, which I do plan to read. And again, thank you.
I I think that's fighting is an especially interesting metaphor for a relationship, because it's like it is so much more conversational than it is violent, right? When people fight in the Matrix, they're doing this sort of like a dance where they're reading one another. They're seeing and engaging intimately. They're not like going up and causing injury to one another's arm. So fighting in the Matrix is, I will extend this a little bit, is almost a metaphor for generative conflict. That these are people who are in conflict, but they're not in conflict that ultimately causes harm or is even designed to cause harm. They're in conflict that is designed to like get to know one another and find a resolution that doesn't create spiraling destruction. So if I a little bit intensely overextend the metaphor, then I think that works. I think that there are forms of fighting someone, there are forms of conflict that can be immensely destructive. If I think about high conflict, forms of conflict where I'm fighting someone, and so I develop a completely untrue story about who they are and what's motivating them in my mind, that becomes a destructive obsession. Like there's versions of that are very untrue. And so I think the question for me is, how do we create conditions for conflict where that is true?
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you so much. What a lively discussion. So much still to talk about here, clearly. So join us in Slack. David, I'll make sure you have a link. We usually do a follow-up thread in the Metagov Seminars channel. So let's keep going, and maybe if there's energy and interest, we could do a follow-up call. But definitely, y'all go check out David's book. It's amazing. Let's talk about it. I want to hear what sticks out to you all. Maybe we could do a Metagov book club of it. That would be really awesome. So if there's interest, let me know. But I'll send you all off on the rest of your days. Thank you so much for joining. Please unmute and give our speaker, author, David, a round of applause. Good to see you all. Thank you, David, for being here.
Ow, ow.
David, are you the voiceover to the audiobook?
Yes, I am.
Oh, awesome. Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. I do have to run and host another call, but it was such an honor to.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day. Lots of love, y'all.